Great, thanks, Paul. Thanks very much. As the questions keep pouring in, I'm going to just add in one tiny final example that I came across that I think there's some method to my madness in why I'm going to tell you about an example from Boston in the US and a similar example in New York. When I was doing the research for the paper I've mentioned, I came across two blogs. One focused on Boston, the link is up there, and one DNA info looking at New York. Both of these examples have used open source software to crowdsource basically the type of thing that Christians mapping focus group discussions were doing. But on a crowdsourced kind of basis. So the idea was people living in New York or Boston could go in and draw the boundaries of how they understood their different neighborhoods. And I think the results are quite interesting in the context of thinking about this in a humanitarian context, partly because these are open source tools that any humanitarian organization could potentially adapt and use, and also because these issues around boundaries aren't just found in the context we've been talking about in the humanitarian world, but also in these cities. In the New York example, the blog describes how there aren't official boundaries and understood neighborhoods in New York. Boston does have official ones, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I just wanted to show a couple of the images from the Boston blog because I think they are quite interesting in the context of this discussion. So the picture that's on your screen right now is of one of the neighborhoods in Boston, and the different shaded colors show the percent agreement of what Christian was calling data saturation. So if more than 75% of people agreed on the area, it's the darker blue, and that's the kind of central area. And then you have more than 50% agreeing with a slightly larger area, and more or less than or 25% agreeing to the wider area there. And I think this is quite interesting. One of the quotes that this blog uses, I'm just going to read it verbatim because it really spoke to me. It says, "Although we talk a lot about boundaries, this blog included, the maps here should also remind us that neighborhoods are not defined by their edges, essentially what is outside the neighborhood, but rather by their contents. And it's not just a collection of roads and things you see on a map. It's also about shared history, activities, architecture, and culture." So while the neighborhood summaries above that they've used in this blog describe the edges on the maps, it's also interesting to think about the area represented by the shapes. Why are they the shapes that they are? What's the significance between difference of opinion between different residents in a neighborhood, people outside the neighborhood? The New York blog that you might take a look at has some interesting data on, for example, people who've lived in an area for more than 20 years. And people who've just arrived, which I think is an interesting reflection, thinking about displacement contexts where people who have recently arrived to an area might have a very different understanding of what they consider neighborhood to people who've been living there. And just to show you a similar example to Christians, this is a map on the left there of the neighborhoods identified through this Boston project, the darker blues being the cores with most agreement, and the lighter blues getting less agreement as it goes. And on the right, that's compared with the official boundaries of Boston, which has a very similar finding as the focus group maps that Impact did, in that there's lots of difference there. There are some similarities, but there's lots of difference, and that's quite interesting to think about. And this kind of difference in shading, I think, is one example of the fuzzy boundaries I was talking about as one way of presenting this sort of disagreement. So we're going to jump into the Q&A now, and I'm going to ask the first question going back to Christian. Somebody's asked if you could give us a bit more information about who comes to the mapping focus group discussions, how those people are invited, how long it takes, and how you ensure that minority or invisible members of a community might get represented in these discussions. Unfortunately, right as I went to Christian, his internet has cut off. So we're going to come back to that question in a second and hope that his internet connection over there in Niger kicks back in. And we're going to go to Paul. Oh, and Paul has some thoughts about the original question for Christian. So we'll turn to Paul now.
So in our case, how we organize these focus group discussions, it's basically we try to approach it from different angles, and we do account for diversity there. So on the one hand, we will approach, say, community leaders and groups through local authorities. So ask them what the different, say, social groups, both in socio-ethnic and other types of identifiers are, and who to invite, who they think can be properly representing the group. On the other hand, we also ask them to keep, say, gender balance and those type of things in mind when inviting people to those focus group discussions. Then, of course, you also need to do your own research and see what organizations, for example, are based in a certain ward. So in one of the wards in Dar es Salaam, the Gambia, there is an albino association, which is quite a vulnerable group, a minority in Tanzania. So that's how we approach it, at least.
Great, thank you. Christian, I think, is just getting reconnected, so we'll ask another question of Paul and then get back to Christian when he's hopefully reconnected. Paul, there's been a couple of questions come in around data. How useful is it to rely on characteristics where there might be poor data? What do you do if data can't be readily verified? And I guess, how do you ensure the quality and I always have trouble with this word, representativeness, there we go, of the data that's used in the maps?
I mean, with respect to that, that does mean you need to have access to some data on inhabitants of an area. What is the distribution in age and economic type of activity, and poor versus rich, this type of data. So for that you want to look, and male versus female, etc. You want to see if there's any statistics available to make sure you're not excluding any socioeconomic ethnic groups that should be present and living in those communities. On the other hand, indeed, there's interviews with ward leaders, with others, so we try to take a look at different types of sources to make sure we have a sort of a good overview of the inhabitants and communities that are present in a location.
Great, thanks very much. And I'm hoping that Christian's back online, so I'm going to come back to him with the question of earlier and also another one. The first question, Christian, was about how you ensure that minority or invisible members in a community are represented in the focus group discussions, and if you could talk a bit about the process, how you select people for the focus group discussions overall, that would be interesting. And also another question's come in about how, when you're using these community-defined maps, how you then coordinate actions with local government who might have be using the administrative boundaries, and how you go back and forth between those. Okay, unfortunately, I don't think that Christian's internet connection has come back fully, so we'll cross our fingers and hope he returns and keep on going forward with another question for Paul. Paul, what would you say are the advantages and disadvantages of using open source tools for mapping?
The advantages, of course, are that the data you're generating can be useful to everyone everywhere. So as opposed to just generating data that's used for a specific use case, that's just scoped within your program, you immediately ensure that there's open, easy access to other people also to use the same type of data now into the future. On the tools that we're using, HOT has quite an extensive range of tools to support both the complete mapping workflow, but also access to information. So some of the tools we use most are also, say, standardized tools among humanitarian organizations. So there's, say, Open Data Kit, which is used quite widely for surveys at different in a wide range of use cases. We have quite some expertise in using ODK, and there's a plugin on top of that, Open Map Kit, which is specifically geared towards gathering data for OpenStreetMap. So in that sense, it integrates quite easily with the tools other humanitarian organizations are already used to utilizing. I couldn't really think of any downsides to using open source tooling. In my view, there's only wins there. The only thing with regards to the data would be that you do need to be careful on the type of data you're exposing on certain, say, vulnerable groups. And there may be scenarios where there's definitely things that you need to be not concerned about, but keeping in mind on what type of data you can and cannot be opening up. So, but that comes before the pushing it out to OpenStreetMap.
Great, thanks, Paul. We're going to try third time's the charm, going back to Christian on the two questions. The first one about how people are selected for the mapping focus group discussions, and then how to coordinate with government actors using perhaps official boundaries, administrative boundaries, rather than the ones identified in the focus group discussions. Christian, go ahead.
Thank you, Leah. I hardly understand you, but I have your question in writing. I hope you can understand me better than I do you. So coming back to the question that you asked about how to choose people to participate in MFGDs, how we chose them. Well, first of all, it's important again to keep in mind what our aim was. Our aim was really to define a geographic entity, an area of knowledge that we could then later use as a basis, as a unit, to gather information on, with the help of key informants, informed key informants within this community area, within this area of knowledge. That being said, we were still trying to be as sort of having as large of a spectrum represented in the focus group discussions as possible. In Jordan, for example, we always tried for each area that we targeted to have at least a female refugee, a female host, male refugee focus group. And indeed, perceptions, they did differ between these four different groups. One finding was that the refugee community, the displaced community in Mafraq, they always had a much smaller conception of the community area, which was probably a very contextual finding. It was probably a matter of interaction with other community members, being less integrated than the hosts that have been living there for generations. So hosts usually had a much bigger understanding of their community area than the displaced in the very same area. In the end, what counted for us was then really, as I said, to come up with a geographic entity, with a community area that was later understood by the key informants that we identified. So that was our main target, our main objective. So in that sense, our focus group discussions may have been in a way biased towards defining an area that can later serve as an entity, a unit of knowledge, an area of knowledge.
Great, thanks very much, Christian. The next question would be for both of you, both Paul and Christian. So we'll come to Paul first and then hopefully go back to Christian afterwards. And the question is about expectations. When you're doing the mapping focus group discussions, the mapping with communities, but you won't be the ones, you're not the organizations responsible for aid delivery. How do you manage expectations around that? So we'll turn to Paul first.
It can be a difficult one at times, but in general, we find that people are really happy to be part of the process. And that, of course, does mean that, yeah, you need to make sure that there's not they're not overestimating what they're gonna say get out of the mapping we do. But in general, we always include local communities and try to make sure we share back on our knowledge we gain and the data we generate. So what we find is that basically everywhere we go, people are already quite happy to have a proper paper map of their own area at the end of the process, which they can start using as a communication tool on the issues they're facing their communities, to local government, to higher levels of government, to other organizations. So basically we're also supplying them, what we're giving back to them is a bit of knowledge, so we try to include them in both the discussions, but if necessary, if we need to do mapping, we also include them in the mapping. We give them some training on how to be using tools, how to use a map, how to use data, and that already makes them feel, well, appreciated and accounted for as human beings living in those communities. So in general, they're already very grateful to be taking part in this exercise, to be part of the process, and also gain something from it in terms of knowledge. We often supply certificates, so they also have something to show for it in terms of skills they can utilize later on, and also prove that they've been taking part of this, and make sure they at least get some products out of the mapping and the process we're going through with them as well. We do make sure, or make clear, that we're not actually the ones that will be working on service delivery or aid operations in that area as well, but we do make sure that we supply them with something useful at the end of the process.
Great, thanks, Paul. And we'll turn also to Christian for his thoughts.
So I'm risking to repeat what Paul just said, as I can't really understand you. Manage expectations when doing mapping sessions, and when you're not responsible for aid delivery. That's a very good question, and I think it doesn't just relate to that mapping exercise. It's a question we always ask ourselves when doing assessments, when not doing delivering aid at first hand, but doing assessments. And especially in Jordan, during our first pilot, that was actually an issue. Especially in Jordan, in north of Jordan, you have a lot of assessment fatigue. There's been a lot of assessments that have been done that are still being done. So people risk having been interviewed for the fourth, the fifth time. So that definitely is a very big issue. And I think in the end, it is hard to address that issue, but one thing that you can do, that you should do, is being transparent. As transparent as you can be with the participants, explaining well what the purpose of this mapping focus group discussion is, and explaining very well what the objective of your project is. Nevertheless, that was definitely an issue we had in Jordan, and some of the participants that we initially identified, they didn't want to participate in the end because of exactly that issue. On the other hand, in DIFA, our second pilot, we experienced the exact opposite. People, they are very willing to participate in our focus group discussions, mapping focus group discussions. There's some feeling of empowerment. People really appreciate being asked about their local experience, about their sort of local communities. That hasn't been done before, and the feedback that we got from the participants in DIFA was a very positive one, particularly because of that feeling of empowerment. So I think to answer that question, I think it's highly context dependent as well.
Great, thanks, Christian. So I'm going to turn to all of our four speakers to just get any final thoughts and advice they would give to our audience today on either choosing or defining the areas when you're working in an area smaller than a city. But before I do that, in case some people have to head out to right at 4 and we run a couple of minutes over, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of our speakers for taking the time out of their busy days to share their experiences with us all today. I found it really interesting, and I'm really looking forward to listening to the recording and looking at the transcript as well, because there's been so much information. It's been hard to take it all in this 2 hours. So thank you so much, and also a huge thank you to the 50 of you listening out there still with us, who stuck with us over the the 2 hours. This is the first 2-hour webinar. ALNAP's done, and my colleagues weren't quite sure how it would go, so I'm glad that so many of you have stuck with us, and I hope it's been interesting. And a final reminder that a survey about your thoughts on the webinar will pop up and also be emailed to you tomorrow. If you could share your thoughts about what you thought about the webinar, we really value that feedback and do use it to inform future urban webinars. So before we end, I'll turn back to Tullio, one of our first hour speakers, to hear any final thoughts, advice that you might have for our audience as a closing thought.
Hi again. I think we've discussed a variety of cases, and I think all of them show the complexity and the need to have a multi-layered vision, no? And to be able to take things forward and address the needs. And then I think it was mentioned by Christine that we need to be transparent with when we intervene to be able to build this integrated approach. Otherwise, we will create ourselves some silos, and that's not what we really want. And then they need to mediate and negotiate with the variety of stakeholders that are in a city. So I think that would be my conclusion: having embracing complexity, being transparent, and be able to mediate and negotiate in order to succeed.
Great, thanks Tullio, and thanks also to Riam, who isn't able to join us for a final reflection, but thank you very much to you both for your presentations and for those thoughts. I'll turn to Christian for any final thoughts and advice for everyone today.
Thank you, Leah. Yeah, I think this whole session has shown across the 4 different presentations that we've heard and the discussions that we've had, I think it has shown that area-based approaches, there's still an immense potential behind that. There's still a lot of things that are not yet fully understood. The concept of community areas, where does a community area start, where does it end? What is the overlap between service areas, community areas? How do I get the best information within a community area, within a service area? How do I target these areas? So I think there's still a lot of work to be done. It was very interesting to see as well all these other different other approaches, and I think there's a lot of interlinkages there. We can think every one of us learn a lot from each other, and I think this is going to be a very hot topic for the next couple of years still. And yeah, for our part, we're very happy to share next year the final results of our 4 pilots. So we've been doing in the first 2 pilots, as we said already, and next year we're trying to come up with a final results report on our particular approach that I've been presenting.
Great, thanks Christian. And finally, I'll turn to Paul for any final thoughts and advice for our participants today.
Thanks, Leah, for organizing this webinar. I think it's a very important topic for everyone to be thinking about a bit more and take into account in our programs. There's also quite a lot that I think we need to think about a bit more how we can integrate it into our products. So, I mean, with the open data platform, OpenStreetMap, we're working on quite a bit. You're more or less contained to mapping or providing access to geographical features. So that means and things that have a geospatial equivalence that mostly pertains to administrative boundaries. But I think it's also quite important for us to think about how we can provide better access to these other types of boundaries we've been discussing, like social perception, service catchment area, service delivery, those type of features. So very helpful for me in that regard. And if anyone would like to speak to us more about how to be integrating the types of boundary mapping we've been doing, then I'd be happy to help there. So thank you.
Great, thanks Paul. So thanks again to all of our speakers and to all of you. We will be, we have recorded this webinar. We will be getting a transcript of it and also an edited version into smaller clips so it's easier to share and watch again. And so all of that will be sent out to you in a couple of weeks, along with all the links that everyone's referred to and the presentations pending speaker agreement. So thank you all again. Please do fill out the survey and please do join us another time for another urban webinar. If you have any ideas, there's a question in the survey to let us know your future ideas and thoughts for future webinars. So thanks again very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.